It's so quiet out here. You can hear the water gently rushing down the Washita River. But other than that, it's completely silent. It's hard to fathom the chaos that took place out here. The gunfire, the screaming. Just the absolute chaos and destruction. After the Cheyenne and Arapaho signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty, they were moved from present-day Kansas and Colorado to a new reservation in Indian Territory, known today as Oklahoma. After relocation, peace was intact despite occasional raids between Cheyennes and Kaw Indians. In early November of 1868, Black Kettle's camp joined other Southern Cheyenne and other tribal bands at the Washita River, which they called Lodgepole River, due to local pine trees and their use. Just 4 years prior to relocating to the Washita River, Chief Black Kettle survived the Sand Creek Massacre, which happened along the Big Sandy Creek here in Colorado, just a few hundred yards behind me. Black Kettle's camp was the furthest west and had around 50 Cheyenne lodges and a few from visiting tribes such as Lakota and Arapaho. There were roughly 250 inhabitants. Downriver to the east, the Washita looped northward, and more camps were located along here. At the northern portion was the Arapaho camp of Little Raven. Big Mouth, Yellow Bear, and Spotted Wolf were all here. At the bottom of the loop was a very large Cheyenne camp under Medicine Arrows. Scattered along the Washita River from this point and east were many more Cheyenne and Arapaho camps. Kiowa leaders Satanta, Lone Wolf, and Black Eagle had moved their villages south to near Fort Cobb, with other camps consisting of more Kiowas, Apaches, and Comanches. It is believed that over 6,000 Native Americans in totality were in winter camp along the Washita River. Despite peace provisions that were supposedly in place at the time, skirmishes would still break out occasionally south of the Arkansas River. Black Kettle and other chiefs had stated time and time again that they wanted to maintain peace, and they had no urge to fight anymore. In October, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the commander of the military division of the Missouri, charged Colonel William Hazen with ensuring provisions for Native Americans who wanted to stay out of the war. If General Sheridan invaded the reservation to pursue potential hostile Native Americans, he needed to spare who he called the well-disposed. Sherman recommended that non-belligerent Native Americans should camp near Fort Cobb. However, Sheridan declared the Cheyenne and Arapaho to still be hostile, which meant that they were subject to attack by the U.S. Army. Now, Colonel Hazen recommended against more tribes coming here to Fort Cobb, as their presence could possibly jeopardize the peace of the Kiowa and the Comanche that were already camped here. Colonel Hazen, after meeting with Black Kettle and Big Mouth, had reported that while the chiefs were sincere in their requests for peace, the younger warriors around them were pleased that peace wasn't officially made, even going as far as stating that the Lakota and other northern bands would come down in the spring and clean out the country. Colonel Hazen took the young warriors' claims seriously, and he requested 2 more companies of the 10th Cavalry from Fort Arbuckle, and a couple of howitzers remained at Fort Cobb for some time. Black Kettle and other chiefs departed Fort Cobb on November 21st with supplies. They traveled through severe, stormy winter weather conditions, eventually arriving on November 26th. The evening before, a war party of 150 warriors or so, which did include men from the camps of Black Kettle, Medicine Arrows, and Little Robe, had returned to the encampments along the Washita River. The same day Black Kettle returned to this area, a party of Kiowa, returning from raiding Utes, passed through Black Kettle's camp on the way to their own village. They told the Cheyenne that as they passed near the Antelope Hills, they had seen a large trail heading south toward the Washita camps. The Cheyenne didn't believe them. They assumed the U.S. soldiers wouldn't operate so far south in such bad winter conditions. On November 26th, Crowneck had seen moving figures near this area that appeared to look like soldiers. Badman discounted his observations, stating that he had seen things due to his guilty conscience from going against the chief's wishes and joining the war party. White Shield, also known as Gentle Horse, had a vision of a wolf wounded on the right side of its head, mourning its little ones, who had been scattered and killed, by a powerful enemy.
He tried to persuade Black Kettle to move camp immediately, but was unsuccessful.
General Philip Sheridan decided upon a winter campaign against the Cheyenne. He figured it would be difficult, but would have decisive results. His goal was to destroy their shelter, food, and livestock in the core of winter, essentially forcing their surrender. He planned to have 3 columns converge on the wintering grounds just east of the Texas Panhandle.
One would come from here at Fort Lyon, Colorado, one from Fort Bascom, New Mexico, and one from right here at Camp Supply.
Lieutenant Colonel Custer commanded the 7th Cav's 800 soldiers against various bands along the Washita River. They set out on November 23, 1868, in the midst of heavy snow, and went south. November 26, 1868, Custer's Osage scouts located the trail of an Indian war party. Custer's troops followed it into the night under the bright moonlight. Eventually, they reached Black Kettle's camp. Custer divided his forces into 4 parts, moving each into position so that at first light they could simultaneously converge on the village. The columns attacked at daybreak.
So this open area behind me here is thought to be where Black Kettle's main camp was located at.
Double Wolf fired his gun to alert the village, and in doing so he was the first killed. Gary Owen played as the cavalry attacked. Cheyenne warriors left their lodges and took cover behind trees and in deep ravines. Custer controlled the village soon, but there were still pockets of resistance all around.
So just on the other side of the Washita River, that's where First Lieutenant William Cook and his 40 sharpshooters were at. They were known as the Corps d'Elite. These sharpshooters were some of the best in the 7th Cavalry, and on the morning of the attack, they hid in the snow and in the bush across the river and waited for targets.
The Osage, enemies to the Cheyenne, were at war with most of the Plains tribes, and their scouts led Custer to the village. The Osage didn't participate in the initial raid, but they did eventually ride into the village, taking scalps and helping round up fleeing Cheyenne women and children.
Not far from here, Black Kettle and his wife were shot in the back and killed. Black Kettle was not a war chief. He was very peaceful. He even had an American flag hanging over his tent. But yet, still attacked and shot in the back. So this small hill behind me is thought to be Custer's command post during the later stages of the battle. It's actually called Custer's Knoll by some people. From here, he'd have a pretty good view of where the main battle was taking place. Unfortunately, he would not be able to see further down by Sergeant Major Creek, where Major Elliott would have his last stand. Custer noticed large groups of mounted Indians gathering on the nearby hilltops, and this caught his attention as he had learned that this was just one of many camps in the vicinity.
Fearing a potential defensive attack, he ordered some men to take defensive positions and others seized their property and horses.
So not far from this spot here is where over 675 to 800 ponies and horses were killed. Now they did spare 200 of them to help transport prisoners back to Camp Supply. And just like at Tool Canyon, 100 miles to the west here, the bones of the horses remained for quite some time, I believe the 1930s, and then they were ground up and used for fertilizer.
During nightfall, Custer began to march his forces toward the other encampments, but noticed other surrounding Indians retreating, and at that point Custer turned around and returned to his supply train. Custer reported to General Sheridan on November 28th that his soldiers found the bodies of over 100 warriors, but there were conflicting reports on the actual estimations of the Indian casualties, and that they were actually much lower. The 7th Cavalry had 21 officers and men killed and 13 wounded. 20 of these soldiers were part of a small detachment led by Major Joel Elliott, who was among the dead. Without Custer's approval, Elliott separated from the companies he led. He yelled, "Here's for a brevet or a coffin," as a small detachment pursued a group of fleeing Cheyenne. They ran into a mixed party of Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Arapaho warriors who were rushing in for aid. In just a single charge, the warriors overwhelmed Elliott and his men.
Custer's abrupt withdrawal without determining the fate of Major Elliott and his missing troops severely damaged his reputation among his peers. His bravery was never called into question, but his judgment was questioned throughout his career. Frederick Benteen, who was a pretty good friend of Major Elliott's, never forgave Custer for the abandonment at the Washita River Massacre. Major Elliott was originally interred at Fort Arbuckle in southern Oklahoma, but he was later moved and reburied here at Fort Gibson National Cemetery.
In Custer's direct frontal assault, the only 7th Cav fatality was Squadron Command Captain Lewis McLean Hamilton, grandson of founding father Alexander Hamilton. The rest of the dead were with the detached command of Major Joel Elliott, who were ultimately killed more than a mile away from the fighting in the village. Captain Hamilton was first buried at Fort Supply with 2 other troopers killed at Washita, but then the captain was moved to his family cemetery in Poughkeepsie, New York. Sergeant Major Kennedy and 16 other cavalrymen under Major Elliott are buried in a mass grave east of the battlefield.
That mass grave can actually be found on private property, not too far from where I am, here in Strong City.
8 years later, when Benteen failed to reach Custer and aid him at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, his actions were examined considering his strong anger toward Custer. In Custer's own words, Indians contemplating a battle, either offensive or defensive, are always anxious to have their women and children removed from all danger. For this reason, I decided to locate our camp as close as convenient to Black Kettle's camp, knowing that the close proximity of their women and children and their necessary exposure in case of conflict would operate as a powerful argument in favor of peace when the question of peace or war came to be discussed. General Sheridan had issued orders for the Washita River expedition, including destroy Indian villages and ponies, kill or hang all warriors, bring back all women and children. The purpose of this total war strategy was to make all segments of Indian society experience the horrors of war as fully as the warriors. Benjamin Clark, highly regarded scout attached to the 7th Cavalry, recalled that women and children were not spared from being killed. He stated the regiment galloped through the teepees, firing indiscriminately and killing women and men alike, shooting at them without mercy. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey observed that soldiers made no effort to prevent hitting women during the attack. The 7th Cav tactical engagement of non-combatants contributed to the destruction of Black Kettle's village. It simply ceased to exist.
The actual number of Indian casualties reported by Custer has always been controversial. No accurate count of the dead on the battlefield was ever taken.
That 100 number had come from Custer's officers, whom he interrogated and asking them what Indians they had seen dead in the village. In a letter to Indian agent Colonel Edward Wincoop on December 17, 1868, Scout J.S. Morrison wrote the official reports of the fight were much exaggerated and that there were not over 20 killed. The rest, roughly 40, were women and children. Cheyenne prisoners interviewed by General Sheridan reported 13 Cheyenne men, 2 Sioux, and 1 Arapaho killed. The journalist Randolph Keim interviewed the women prisoners and arrived at the same tally, even receiving names. As for women and children killed, Custer stated, "The Indians admit a loss of 140 killed, besides a heavy loss of wounded. Thus, with the Indian prisoners we have in our possession, makes the entire loss of the Indian in killed, wounded, and missing not far from 300. If those numbers were true, that would mean virtually everyone in Black Kettle's village was killed or captured. So it's obvious Custer's initial figures were inflated, and the specific sources of his info actually remain unknown."
So was this a battle, or was it a massacre? Historians have debated this since it happened, and they will continue to.
The Indian Bureau described this event as a massacre of innocent Indians, and some humanitarian groups denounced it as cold-blood butchery. The surviving Cheyenne considered it a horrific event that gravely impacted their lives and community. The loss of many tribal elders by itself was profoundly damaging to Cheyenne families and society. Custer himself didn't consider it a massacre, stating that they didn't kill every Indian in the village and said it was unavoidable killing a few women as some took up weapons and fought. Jerome Green mentioned in his book that soldiers did take measures to protect the women and the children. The December 14th New York Tribune reported that Colonel Wincoop, agent for the Cheyenne and Arapahoes, published his letter of resignation and regarded Custer's late fight as a massacre, and that Black Kettle and his friendly band of Indians were on their way to the reservation when attacked. The scout James Morrison wrote Colonel Wynkoop that twice as many women and children as warriors had been killed during the attack. Historian Paul Andrew Hutton wrote, "Although the fight on the Washita was one-sided, it was not a massacre. Black Kettle's Cheyennes were not unarmed innocents living under the impression that they were not at war. Several of Black Kettle's warriors had recently fought the soldiers, and the chief had been informed by Hazen that there would be no peace until he surrendered to Sheridan. Custer personally stopped the slaying of non-combatants." Historian Joseph B. Toburn considers the destruction of Black Kettle's village too one-sided to be called a battle. He stated, "What if a superior force of Indians attacked a white settlement containing no more people than were in Black Kettle's camp? With like results, the incident would doubtless be titled a massacre." I tend to agree with historian Stan Hoig, who argues that the conflict fit the definition of a massacre because a group of people, even one in possession of weapons as the Cheyenne, were killed indiscriminately, mercilessly, and in large numbers.